Hi there. So after all the technical details, let's look at the big picture again and how you can use these knowledge graphs in practice. So in the example, we're going to look at an online bookstore. And let's start with one book, the one shown here, The Glass Palace, in this online bookstore. Now, behind the online bookstore, most likely you have a classical database, a relational database with multiple tables, like shown here. You have information about the ISBN number, the author, title, publisher, and then you have these relationships, the foreign keys. The author is in another table, in this case, name and homepage, and likewise more information about the publisher. So that's the standard web technology nowadays, database with a web front end. Now, one thing we can do is we export this database in form of a graph. A bit later on in the course, you'll see that there are libraries for doing this kind of export. But what we'll end up with is a knowledge graph. So we have a URL. Yeah, the ISBN number is going to be a URL in that bookstore with a specific number. And then we have information like the title and the year. So these are going to be literals. And we have more information about the publisher and the author. Here, we are modeling this with these blank notes I mentioned earlier. So a publisher is something that has a city and a publisher name, and an author is something where we have a name and a homepage. So for now, we have simply did an export. We didn't do anything more. We just changed the format from a table into a graph. By itself, that is not very exciting. We just transformed one data format into another. But now let's assume we have yet another bookstore. This time we have a French bookstore. So we have the same book in there, but this time we have the French translation. Behind this other bookstore, again, there is going to be a database. Most likely it's going to be structured a little bit differently. For example, for a book like the one here, we're going to have the translator of the book, which is something that didn't exist in the other database. So again, we have a database, multiple tables, and we can transform this database. We can export it into a graph, just like we did for the first one. And in this case, what we would end up with is something like this. We have the book with an ISBN number, but now we have something that we didn't have before, namely a link to a different URI with the ISBN number of the original. And then the other information we had in the database, like the author and the translator. So now what we have is we have two different databases. Both of them we transformed into a graph. So now, okay, for now we haven't really gained anything. But the next step, that's the interesting bit, is we can now merge this data. So if you look very closely, you should be able to tell how we can merge these two data sets. Do you see it? Well, I can't hear you, but let's say you found out that the same URI appeared twice. This appeared in both data sets. So now we can merge these two graphs because this is essentially the same node. So we end up with a graph that has these merged information. So now you might wonder, okay, so what? Well, now we can query this graph. We can ask questions to the graph. For example, we can ask, what is the title of the original, of the French version? If you look at the French dataset, it has the French title. The English dataset has the English title, but we cannot answer this question by either dataset alone. But now by merging these two together, we can answer this question. We can give the title of the original of the French title. So far, we merged only the URI of the ISBN. later in the next lecture, you'll see we can do some additional information. For example, we had here the author in English and auteur in French, and this is essentially the same thing. So if we can somehow supply this information that author and auteur are the same thing, then we can also merge these two information together. A bit more on this again next week, but if we get this information here, we can also merge the information about the author. So this person we can link together as well. And now, just like before, we can make additional queries. So for example, we can ask, what is the homepage of the original's author? And again, this is information that was not in either dataset, not in the French one or the English one. But we can answer this question after we have merged these two datasets together. If you look here, we have the French version, we have the author of the original, and in the original dataset, we also had the information about the homepage. So we can answer this question as well. And we don't have to stop here. So far, we only merged the two datasets from the systems themselves, the database from the French bookstore, from the English bookstore, but we can merge this with any other knowledge graph on the web. You've already seen Wiki, the Wikipedia knowledge graph on the web. So I mentioned that this is basically the machine readable version of Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia has information, for example, about the author. So using the homepage URI, we can come to the Wikipedia URI for this author. And then we can from there go into the Wikipedia knowledge graph and get initial information about this author. For example, from the Wikipedia, we can read out what are the other books that this author has written. And now this is something that wasn't in any of these databases, but an intelligent assistant could now answer questions like, tell me about some other books written by the same author, and it would give you the information about these books. And you don't have to stop here. You can also get the information about this birthplace. So you get the information about the city and you can answer questions about the city. And then you don't have to stop in the Wikipedia. You'll see there are other knowledge graphs, for example, geographic databases. You can look at the latitude and longitude, get maps and other information about the city. So now you can sort of get an idea why these intelligent assistants, Siri, Alexa, Google Assistants, why they seemed so smart and know so much. You can ask them all kinds of questions and they are able to come up with an answer. Not always the correct one, and doesn't always make the right connections, but surprisingly often you get a good answer. And this is because they have this underlying knowledge graph where they can connect these different pieces of information and then come up with an answer by querying this knowledge graph. If you think about how you work with the web, in most cases is what you do. You go from one page to the other, you connect the different pieces of information together, and then you draw some conclusions. You are able to answer a question. But the interesting bit is now with this formalization, with this RDF and some other techniques we'll learn later, now you can write a system, an AI that does the same thing, for example, to answer questions. For this, there is a final exercise on the worksheet, task number 10. And once you're done with that, I'll see you for the final part of the lecture. See you then.